magic, multiverses, mutants. They are central to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and in how many people talk about evolution. In today's episode, you'll find out why evolution is more science fiction than real science, and why the evidence actually points to design, not blind chance. Welcome to the Faith Science Podcast, episode 45. I'm your host, Jerry Swafford, and on this podcast, we explore the integration of science with faith. Today, we're going to talk about magic, multiverses, and mutants. And perhaps you're familiar with these from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We're going to be talking today about how they actually figure heavily into how many people talk about evolution. So what we'll do is we'll start with the idea of evolution being something like a Marvel storyline. We'll see why evolution needs magic to make any sense. We'll look at evidence for the multiverse. Spoiler alert, there isn't any. And then finally, we'll look at how Marvel's mutants need evolution, that it's a central part to the entire storyline of the mutants and X-Men and stuff like that. And then we'll end with the alternative, which is the intelligent designer God. So let's start with the first idea. Is evolution just a Marvel storyline? Well, if you think about the Avengers, this is the picture we began with. You got Hulk right there. You got Hawkeye. Iron Man is probably... Between Iron Man and Captain America, they are two of the more popular guys. Went in Civil War, I probably, if you're familiar with any of those movies, I was kind of probably more team Captain America. But as a robotics engineer, the Iron Man story is just a really interesting one. Just as a side note, the idea that you can build something like the Iron Man suit by yourself is ridiculous. But I mean, that's just an aside. That's more science fiction than almost anything else that you see on there. That one man can just build that huge suit like that. And he's just really smart. And that's how he's able to do that. That doesn't actually happen in real life. So you've got all of these different characters here. Captain America, you have Thor there. Basically a godlike figure in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And they would come together and they save the world and they have these different powers. We're going to talk more about X-Men later. But when you think about these different people, we understand that this is basically science fiction. It was funny. I went online. I don't think it was Reddit, but someone was asking the question: is Marvel, the Marvel comics, is that science fiction or is it fantasy? And so they were trying to nail down what the genre is of Marvel. And I mean, the basic answer is yes. It's both. It's fantasy. So you have stuff in there with these interesting characters, but there's a lot of science fiction-y type stuff, and they might even call it science fantasy, I guess. So that's why it really figures into what we talk about on this channel, in part, really kind of tearing down these ideas of macroevolution because it's science fiction. And so when you talk about evolution, well, is that science fiction or fantasy? And I say the same thing. The answer is yes. It's both. It's fantasy. It's this fantasy world that has been constructed. These ideas that are anti-scientific. So they are. It sounds sciencey. It's pseudoscience, but it's not true science. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. So evolution is like this, very similar to the Marvel stuff, where it's these interesting stories that are entertaining. But the question is, well, is any of that real? No, it's all fiction. It's all fantasy. So let me start with what we mean by evolution. When I say evolution here, I'm talking specifically about what many people would call macroevolution versus something like microevolution. And this distinction is really important. I see people conflate these two all of the time. They take something like microevolution, which are small changes that occur among species, and they say two different things. First of all, they say, well, that's the same as macro. You just have to have a longer time horizon. And that's just not true. And we'll talk about why that is later on today. But the other thing that can often happen is they will say that it's evidence of the larger scale changes. So it's both. They'll say, well, it's evidence of larger scale changes. And they will say, well, this is really what happens when you have those larger scale changes. And neither one of those things is the case. Everybody, believers, atheists, agnostics, science people, non-science people, everybody can observe small changes among species. If you've ever bred dogs, you see this. We can see that. The question is, did large scale changes where, again, just to use an example, an ant turning into an elephant, or there being a progression along those lines, did that ever happen? Is that something that has happened? According to the evolutionary story, that has happened countless times because everything that exists came from some very simple, maybe single celled organism back millions, if not billions of years ago. I don't care to nail down whatever the time horizons are because they always change. So whatever I say now will be different because they are increasingly finding that it doesn't make sense even for the really long time horizons that they already give. And so that's why it moves around so much. It doesn't do any good to try to look up what they're saying it is now. Okay. So one of the things we just pointed out is that small changes are not evidence for large scale changes, and small changes also aren't some kind of precursor or to those large scale changes. That if you just put together enough of them over time. My favorite example of this, as I have a 6-year-old nephew and he can write, and I generated this image that you see on your screen from AI, and it's just a young boy, actually younger than what my nephew would be. So it looks like it's a young black boy, probably 4 or 5 years old, with a pencil in his hand, writing letters. Now, if you look at the paper, though, again, the AI generated some stuff where it looks a lot like writing letters, but then when you look closely, almost none of those things look like letters. I can see an O there. I can see an upside down E, it looks like, maybe a D, but a lot of those things don't look like letters at all. And so the idea, though, would be that if you look at that 4-year-old child and say, look, he can write letters, so that is evidence that he wrote this novel, everybody would look at you and say, well, no, that's not evidence of that. That just shows that he can write letters. That doesn't mean that he can write that novel. And if you were to show that the letters that he wrote on the page are all found in the novel, that still doesn't mean that he wrote the novel. It just means that he can write letters. Uh, Another example to think about is, let's say you had a woman who's in her 90s and she can take 2 steps without falling. And then you use that as evidence to say that she walked across the country last week in 7 days. You say if she can take 2 steps, then let's not say it's 7 days. Let's say it took her 3 months, but she on foot walked across the entire country because you saw that she could walk 2 steps with as long as she has her cane, she can walk 2 steps, and therefore her being able to walk 2 steps is enough evidence to say that she could have walked across the entire country in 3 months. And we would all say that's ridiculous. You being able to do 2 steps has nothing to do with whether you can go all the way across the entire country. But this is exactly what people do when they conflate micro with macroevolution. They take something that's a couple of steps that no one disputes. Okay, yeah, she can walk 2 steps. She can walk across that room. That's not the same thing as saying that she can walk across the entire country given enough time. Well, if you give her 3 months, if you give her a year, that 90-something-year-old woman is not walking across the entire country. Give her a year, give her 2 years, give her 5 years. She's not going to do that. And so this gets back to what we're talking about. You would need to show me more than she can walk across the room a couple of steps before you're going to convince or persuade anybody that she can go across the entire country. That 4-year-old child's going to need to show more than he can write letters in order to be able to justify saying that he's written a novel, a 300-page novel. And what's so interesting about these examples is that they pale in comparison to what people are saying about evolution. The small to great comparisons are actually even larger for evolution. It's even worse than this. And yet we would never go along with these kinds of conclusions, but people go along with them all the time. Okay. So I have an acronym that I call BAY. And I use that acronym in part because there is a slang term, BAY, which it can be used as an acronym before anyone else or before all else. The idea that that's your baby, that's your boo, that's your sweetheart kind of idea. And so people use that term BAY today to denote that idea, this person that you place before everyone else. Before everyone else would be BEE, so B, not BAY. BAY is before all else or before anyone else. But I use that term not just to talk about not that I don't use the term BAY. So anybody out here thinking I'm using the term BAY for somebody right now, just relax. No, it's Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution. And what's so interesting is that people who believe these things believe them and put them before any other ideas or before all else. And so Big Bang, abiogenesis, evolution, these stand, if you talk against them at all, people get angry, people are upset, and this is why we go after them, because they are untrue. They are science fiction, and so people need to understand this and understand the implications of believing something that's untrue like this. So when I call something bae, I'm not speaking of some girlfriend or something. I'm speaking about Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. Now, by the way, if I need to define those terms, let's go ahead and do that now. The Big Bang hypothesis, sometimes called theory, it doesn't rise to the level of a theory, but it is a hypothesis. The Big Bang hypothesis is the idea that from essentially nothing, I don't mind inserting that adverb there, essentially, but any of the models essentially say that there was nothing, and then into existence all of what we see of the known universe popped. And so that's the Big Bang hypothesis. We'll talk more about the man who actually coined that phrase, who hated when it first came about. He hated the idea, and he came up with the term Big Bang it was disparaging. He actually didn't like it, but the name stuck, interestingly enough, and we'll talk about why he didn't like it. But that's Big Bang. Abiogenesis. Whenever you see a at the beginning of that prefix generally means not or without, and so bio is life and genesis is beginning. So the idea of abiogenesis means that there's the beginning of life, there's a beginning that comes from non-life is the idea. So a, not, bio, life, genesis, not life, beginning. And so the idea is that the beginning of life came from non-life. We'll talk about that. That's a ridiculous idea, but it is an idea that is proposed nonetheless. Finally, evolution. We talked about evolution, the idea of complex, diverse life forms coming from far less complex and much simpler life forms. All right. So at its core, the thing you need to understand about evolution is that it's a story. This is why when we talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it lines up so well. Evolution is a story. The people that espouse these things, it's a mythology, it's a story, and it's a story about how things may have come to be. And what's so interesting is when you oppose it, and people say, well, you don't believe in evolution? No, I don't. I don't believe that story. I don't believe that mythology. So you should come up with something else, something that makes more sense. And so at its core, it is a mythology. It is a story. And whenever you see people mention evolution, they have some story that they're telling about how things happened. And so they'll tell you, oh, well, millions of years ago, it was this. So for example, I'm a carnivore, and I'll talk maybe some more about carnivore at the end, meaning I eat only meat. There are, rare breaks where I step away from meat, but for the most part, I eat meat. So beef and eggs and chicken and pork, and I don't eat any vegetables or fruit or sugar of any kind. And so when you eat like that, it's interesting that the proponents of carnivore often will say, well, evolutionarily, this makes sense. We were made to be carnivores. I don't know if that's true or not. I don't know if God made, well, let me take that back. I do know that God did not make us to be carnivores. I do know that according to Genesis chapter 9, meat was given to Noah and those who came off of the ark. But originally, mankind was made and we were eating plants, according to the book of Genesis, chapter 2. So we do know that things were that way, and that things changed after mankind got off of the ark and meat was given to them. Now, we do know that we are omnivores. Ultimately, we can eat meat and we can eat plants. And so what the proper human diet is, to use a phrase from Dr. Ken Berry, to know exactly what that is, well, I don't know. I think most of us should be eating a lot more meat than we are, but that's not going to be the subject of this today. My point is that sometimes the carnivores will say, well, we were made to be this way, and the proper human diet is a meat only or a mostly meat diet. But what's so interesting is the vegans and the vegetarians say almost exactly the same thing. They'll tell you that, oh, well, this is a you should be eating only plants. Humans were made to eat plants, and both sides will use some kind of evolutionary perspective. Why? Because it's a story, and you can make up the story to be whatever you want it to be. And I'm not saying one side or the other is making up their story. They're trying to look at, bones and fossils and say, well, our teeth are like this, so we should be eating meat. The other side will say the same thing about plants. The point is, you're making up a story, and you're taking the evidence and you're making up a story. And evolution at its core is that. Okay. So to get back to the three things that we're talking about today: magic, multiverses, and mutants. Abiogenesis is a story that needs magic, right? In order to get life from non-life, which is something that we never see happen, ever, there's something called the law of biogenesis that we're going to talk about. It's a story that needs magic. You need magic to occur to create life from non-life. The Big Bang also needs magic, by the way, to create something from nothing, to create a universe out of nothingness. You kind of need magic. But what you also require is something called the multiverse, or I'll say multiverses, because the idea of needing alternate multiverses relaxes the apparent design that we see in the universe. If you can say that there were just an infinite number of universes out here, then you can also say, well, maybe things aren't designed the way believers say that they are. And then finally, evolution is all about mutant characters, right? Like that's evolution at its core is talking about mutations all the time, and talking about how mutated species are better than those that don't have the mutations. And we're going to look at that and see if that actually makes sense, or if that's just a Marvel storyline. So, why does evolution need magic? Now, when I say evolution here, I'm really talking about the entire framework of Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution, but we'll just say evolution for short there. Okay, so this is Doctor Strange from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't know a whole lot. I think I saw the first movie there. I haven't really watched anything since then, but he's a guy that was formerly a doctor. Like, I think he was a surgeon or something I'm sure there are people that are going to correct me in the comments or whatever. I don't remember. I didn't pay much attention to the Doctor Strange movies, but he was apparently a medical doctor. And then he stumbled upon kind of this being able to do magic and stuff. And so you see that in the movies. You also see someone called the Scarlet Witch. I don't know much about her either, except, she'll move her hands around and make things pop out. And so these magical characters are a significant part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So when we think about why evolution would need something like this, what we see is that there are laws of science that Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution defy and actually go against those laws. And so let's start with the first one, which is the first law of thermodynamics. It states that energy can be neither created nor destroyed. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. And sometimes people say matter or energy because, again, if we're talking about matter and energy, Einstein's equation E equals mc squared, where you have mass and the speed of light or basically mass being related to energy by the square of the speed of light. So matter and energy can't be created or destroyed. So this is the first law of thermodynamics. There's a law of thermodynamics, meaning we don't see that law broken. That's why it becomes a law, and it's not something that is just a hypothesis or a theory, and we're not sure about it. But no, it's a law. Well, according to the Big Bang hypothesis, matter exploded into existence from nothing. And that is supposed to be a hypothesis to explore. But that goes against the first law of thermodynamics. You have matter popping into existence from nothing. Now, someone might say, well, you say that God created things ex nihilo, basically from nothing, but he's not nothing. So I'm not saying that there was absolutely nothing and then the universe popped into existence. That's what these people are saying. I'm saying that there was something, there was someone who existed and may have popped things into the physical universe, but there was something that actually existed that caused that to come into existence. That doesn't go against laws of nature. That's, again, God is creating the laws of nature at that point anyway. So this Big Bang hypothesis goes against the first law. of thermodynamics. Okay, the law of biogenesis. Okay, we mentioned what abiogenesis is. Biogenesis is life beginning. And the law of biogenesis simply states that life can only arise from pre-existing life. So you don't have life popping into existence from non-life. It's literally the idea of life popping into existence from non-life is literally opposed to this law of biogenesis. Well, what does abiogenesis say? Abiogenesis says, yeah, life arose spontaneously from non-living matter. Now, which one do you go with? Do you go with abiogenesis, that story, that mythology, or do you go with the law of biogenesis? That's for you to choose. Second law of thermodynamics states that entropy or disorder is something that increases over time. And one way to think about the second law of thermodynamics, I took thermodynamics in engineering school, and so that wasn't my particular area, but it was one of those weed out classes. And I was at Tennessee State University, and the dean of the College of Engineering, he would teach that class, and there were people that took it 2-3 times. So by the time I got to the end of that semester, I knew thermodynamics really well. I started off doing poorly on the homework. If you got any little thing wrong on the homework, he'd mark the entire thing wrong. And I had a terrible homework grade. By the end of that quarter, though, or by the end of that semester, though, I aced one of his final tests, which is, again, almost an impossible feat, but I did. And he couldn't mark anything wrong on my paper. And so thermodynamics is an area that I feel is not my particular area, but for that semester, I dug into it pretty deeply, and I did some more when I later on in graduate school as well. But these laws, these first and second laws of thermodynamics, are actually pretty straightforward. The second law really essentially states that things move in a certain direction. Heat, for example, moves in a certain direction. You don't have heat that goes from a hotter area and go to an even hotter area. So, or to a, yeah, so you don't have heat move from a higher concentration or from a lower concentration to a higher concentration, right? So the way to think about it is this. Let's say you have an ice cube and you put it on the table in a room that's 70 degrees Fahrenheit. We expect that the heat from the room will transfer to the colder piece of ice and melt it, right? So heat moves from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration, not the other way around. So you don't have heat leaving the ice cube and going to the outer surroundings so that the ice actually gets even colder and harder. No, the ice melts, or the ice cream melts. It's the same thing. So, and the idea here is that there's a certain direction that things go in. Things go from orderly to more disorderly. And over time, entropy increases over time. And this is a law. It's not something that you would say is, well, it happens sometimes. No, it's a law. So as we go to our next idea here, what we see is that this law emerges in other areas. So again, as we mentioned, hot things get cooler, meaning that the heat leaves the higher concentration and goes to an area of lower concentration, like the surroundings. But we see it everywhere. We see clean rooms get messy over time, right? A room doesn't get cleaner or more organized on its own. This is part of the second law. It's an extension of the second law of thermodynamics, that it gets more disorderly over time. It doesn't get less. And the only way it does get less disorderly is that there is energy that is deliberately inputted to the system, meaning your mother tells you to go in there and clean your room, and you deliberately do it. You don't just kind of say, well, the room will clean itself. No, that's not how it works. And so that if something is warm, in order to keep it warm, you have to continue to add heat. If you have a room that is going to continue to remain clean, there has to be an addition of effort and work of some kind to have that happen. Great teams, if you're thinking about a work environment, if you have a team that does really well, you're going to have leadership and you're going to have people that are working at it. It doesn't just happen. If you have a great team that they work together well and they get things done, your families are like this. It doesn't just happen. There is work that must occur. There is effort that must be done. That's what the second law of thermodynamics says. That if you're going to have things change, they're going to generally change to be more disorderly. They're going to change in a way that heat is going to go from higher concentration to lower concentration. There's a certain direction that things go in, and it's generally not good. Evolution says the exact opposite of this. Evolution says that we began with very simple life forms, and that over time they became more complex, more capable, but there was no guidance, there was no deliberation behind it, there was no thought, there's no purpose. It just happened. It just you had these single-celled organisms, and they became multicellular, and then it became things with organs and systems, and it just happened, unguided, no process, it's a process, but there are all of these. There's all this agency that gets put in there, like the term natural selection. But ultimately, they're saying that there's no thought, there's no work, there's no effort behind, there's no design. It looks like it is, but it's not really. And this is what they would tell you. This is in direct opposition to the second law of thermodynamics. So the question we have to ask is, which one do you go with? Do you go with Big Bang, abiogenesis, or evolution that go against these laws of thermodynamics and biogenesis? Or do you reject that story because it's, well, science fiction? What would you call a story about the world in which the laws of biogenesis and thermodynamics were broken? I'd call it science fantasy. I would call it science fiction. That's what you call that. And yet this is precisely what people are saying about the world. When you talk about Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution, you are talking about three ideas that break laws of biogenesis, thermodynamics, even law of cause and effect, right? Like the idea that you can have the effect of the known universe come from the cause of nothing is a ridiculous idea. So it breaks all of these known laws of logic and science to believe these things. So this is why it's so important for us to talk about it, because it's science fiction being passed off as science, and then people are being told that you are stupid or that you are unintelligent for rejecting science fiction. But it's not unintelligent. What happens is any alternative view is silenced, and this is how people get away with this. So we don't want that to happen here. So we talked about how Bay needs magic, evolution needs magic. But the next thing we want to talk about is this idea of the multiverse. What is the evidence for a multiverse? And we might want to start with, what is a multiverse anyway? What's a multiverse? Well, so it's kind of a play on this word universe. Universe means there's one environment, and multiverse means that there are multiple universes. And generally what people mean is that there could be alternate realities. It's really interesting because I think it's not exactly related to the idea of simulation theory, which is that we're all in a simulation, but it's similar in the sense that people essentially say that there could be these alternate versions, these alternate universes, and maybe an infinite number of them. So there can be some alternate universe where there's another Jerry that has a different life, that, well, he really went more down the line of being an artist. He liked to draw when he was younger. Instead of going the direction of engineering, he's more of an artist. Or he went in a different direction and he wanted to play basketball, or he wanted to whatever. I have all these different interests, and maybe in these alternate universes, Jerry became a different person. That, instead of being single right now, and he was married 10 years earlier and has 7 kids and all of this stuff, right? Like this idea of that there are these different alternate realities. Now, we see this in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is the famous Spider-Man meme, where you have like 3 different Spider-Mans all pointing at each other. And the question is, well, which one is Spider-Man? And it's funny, there is the 3 actors that have most recently played Spider-Man in the Spider-Man movies, Tom, from left to right, Tom Holland, Andrew Garfield, and Tobey Maguire. They reenacted they recreated the Spider-Man meme, where they're like, well, which one of you is Spider-Man? And this is even in one of the latest Spider-Man movies, where Tom Holland is the most recent Spider-Man, but they're in the multiverse. And so what they did is they basically brought back the other 2 Spider-Man movies that really weren't dealing with multiverse at all, but they take this idea of multiverse in the new Spider-Man movie and then basically portray those other movies as if they were alternate realities. So all of them were Spider-Man, all of them were Peter Parker, and then there's this place in where you can step through a portal and somehow access these other alternate universes and realities. Now, again, that's really cool for Marvel Cinematic Universe. There's even this. It's funny. My nephew, um, there would tell me about this new Spider-Man, who's black. I think he's like half black, half Hispanic or something, and his name is Miles Morales. So Spider-Man was always, a white kid named Peter Parker, but now there's a young black kid in this multiverse, in this alternate universe, who's Spider-Man 2. And so it's really confusing for me. I haven't seen any of that yet, but I'm sure he'll want to watch that sooner or later. This idea of, okay, which one's Spider-Man? Well, they both are Spider-Man. They're just in alternate realities and alternate universes. And sometimes you can step through a portal and go through. Okay, that's cool for a Marvel movie. But interestingly enough, this has seeped into what people talk about when it comes to belief in an evolution, for instance, or belief in, let's say, the universe specifically. So let's talk about the universe and how one of the things that happens is that, again, you may be asking the question here that, well, what does talking about multiverses have to do with the Big Bang hypothesis or any of the Big Bang hypotheses, let's say? And the answer to that is, it really comes down to the fine-tuning argument. It's one of the most compelling arguments for, or the compelling reasons to believe in there being deliberation, thought, design behind the universe. Because what we see is that there's fine-tuning of the universe, and it is uniquely fitted for human life. And people don't like this because it really does point to the idea of a designer. And we could go to all kinds of examples of this. Some people point out that if the Earth were just slightly closer to the sun, we'd burn to a crisp. If it was slightly farther away from the sun, it would be too hot or it'd be too cold for humans to exist on the planet. And so there are little things like that throughout the universe that we look at, and we see this place called Earth that has life on it and has human life on it, and we see that everything is dialed in just right for that to happen. So much so that even if things are off just by a tiny amount, and we'll talk about some examples of this in a second, but if things were just off by a tiny amount, human life could not exist here. And so people have pointed out, okay, well, this universe appears to be finely tuned for human life. What do we do with that? Do we say it just happened? Do we say that it popped into existence from nothing with no thought, deliberation behind it, and then it just happened to be finely tuned for human life? That's what we're having to say here. That's what these people are saying, and that's a really tough sell. So enter the multiverse, because let's say, for instance, if there are millions, billions of different universes, and we just happen to be on one that seems to be uniquely tuned for human life, well, that's not that crazy, because the odds might be kind of long in terms of something being finely tuned. But if there are many, many billions of different universes, and all of the rest of them, they didn't work out, but this one did, and we happen to be on it, then we don't have to deal with those probabilities anymore. And this is what people essentially say. Well, we don't have to deal with the probabilities, because if there are just billions of universes out here, then we don't have to really think about that. So let's start with, and I'm going to give some quotes from three different guys that are not believers. So I want to be clear here. These are physicists and cosmologists who are not believers in God, and who either prefer things like the multiverse, or they certainly aren't agreeing or haven't agreed with the kinds of conclusions that I'm making. So I want to be clear here. These are not believers saying this. This is Fred Hoyle. He is the man who came up with the term Big Bang theory. And he was using it as a disparaging term. He was making fun of this idea. He believed in something more of a steady state model, which again has since lost favor. Nobody really believes what he was going with at the time. But here's the thing that he said: a common sense interpretation of the facts a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. Now, again, Hoyle is not somebody who's a believer. He is not someone who is a theist. But what he says is, if you just look at what we see here, this suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics, chemistry, and biology for all of this to be the way it is. Now, again, they might conclude something like panspermia, which is the idea that some kind of alien life planted things here on this earth. They planted the seed of life on this earth and then left. It's so interesting how these people are willing to go along with ideas that are ridiculous, and as long as it means they don't have to believe in God. And that's one of the things I want to point out continually here, that there are all of these science fiction ideas that are being proposed here just so you don't have to believe in God. And that's what's going on here. He's mentioning this idea of a super intellect. Does he believe in a super intellect? No. But he's saying, hey, it really looks like a super intellect has done this. And the numbers are so overwhelming that you really can't get away from it. Again, a guy that didn't want to, the thing that Fred Hoyle understood about the idea of Big Bang, because at the time there was still this thought that potentially the universe could just be eternal, and that you could just go in this infinite regress and never get to the bottom of it. But the evidence began to pile up that the universe indeed has a beginning, and those who were putting forth these kinds of hypotheses were using terms like Big Bang for it, that it popped into existence. Now, again, Fred Hoyle understood the theistic implications of it. They said, well, if you start, teaching this Big Bang stuff, then people are going to start saying that there was a creator, there was a God. Now, again, you might say, well, Jerry, why are you so opposed to Big Bang then, if Hoyle understood that it pointed to the beginning of the universe and therefore the existence of a God? Well, because again, Big Bang isn't what happened. So Big Bang is getting us closer. It at least allows many of these scientists to acknowledge, hey, there was a beginning to all this. Because as long as there wasn't a beginning, you could again reject the idea of God. But even with Big Bang, what have they done? Well, they try to push it so far back in time, you still don't need a God. It just kind of popped into existence. Okay, let's look at the next quote from Lee Smolin. Perhaps before going further, we should ask just how probable is it that a universe created by randomly choosing the parameters will contain stars? Given what we have already said, it is simple to estimate this probability. For those readers who are interested, the arithmetic is in the notes. The answer, in round numbers, comes to about 1 chance in 10 to the 229th power. Now, again, we don't do very well with these kinds of numbers. They're so astronomical. It's very difficult to even, like, I can't even wrap my mind around. When you think about a number like a trillion, okay? So 1,000 is 10 to the 3rd power. 1,000,000 is 10 to the 6th power. 1,000,000,000 is 10 to the 9th power. And 1,000,000,000,000 is 10 to the 12th power. When you're talking about something like 10 to the 229th, like a trillion is just beyond what we can barely understand a trillion or get to a quadrillion or a quintillion or something like that, where you're talking about 10 to the 12th, 10 to the 15th, 10 to the 18th, 10 to the 229th. We're talking about 1 with 229 zeros. So it's way more atoms than are even in the known universe. So meaning that if you take all of the atoms, not just in this on the Earth, but in the known universe, that number is, I think, something like 10 to the 80, 10 to the 229th. And what he's saying here is that the idea that the universe could have just randomly generated parameters that would allow us to have stars The idea that that could just happen randomly. So again, given billions and again, this is way past billions though. That's the issue here. But given billions and trillions of universes, again, the issue you have is that the probability of randomly generating these parameters is 1 in 10 to the 229th, which is such an astronomical number. I mean, it's beyond what you, I mean, it's way past what we would even consider to be something like infinity. A practical infinity would probably be 10 to the 20th or something like that. 10 to the 229th. Now, this is a really intellectual way of saying it couldn't have happened randomly. That brings us to Paul Davies. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. Now, this is getting to what believers are pointing out, and what increasing numbers of even agnostics and atheists are willing to concede. This thing looks designed. And so what you do with that, what you do with your conclusions after that, is up to you. You could say, well, it's not really designed. It just looks designed. That's what people often say. But to say that there's no question that it looks designed. The impression of design is overwhelming. And so what you can do with that, if you can look at something that appears to be designed, and you can just say, oh, it's not actually designed. But Davies here, again, someone who's not a believer, someone who is not a person who is believing in something like the idea of intelligent design. Paul Davies says the impression of design is overwhelming. Okay. So again, why would people propose multiverses? Well, for the reasons we just saw. The impression of design in the universe is overwhelming. But what if there were just an infinite number of universes? Then if there were an infinite number of universes, then potentially you could have one that looks designed like this. And that's the idea. But the problem is that there is no evidence that anything like a multiverse exists. What we see is our universe. So why do people come up with it? Well, it relaxes this pressure that comes when you start seeing it looks like a designer out here that has done this. Somebody's messed with the physics. Somebody's messed with the chemistry and the biology. A super intellect has done something here. And instead of saying, can we look for more evidence about this what about this hypothesis about the super intellect? They don't want to have a hypothesis about the super intellect because there's a fear about where that will lead. The observation of complexity, organization, design, purpose, these things imply that the universe has been designed. So we could take that and go with, okay, the universe, let's use that hypothesis, the intelligent design hypothesis. People don't like the intelligent design hypothesis because they don't like where it's going to lead. All right. Our final main point here today is about evolution specifically and the mutations part. Because if you're like me and you grew up in the 90s, you're familiar with Marvel's X-Men. You got the theme music. I might try to play the theme music right now in the video of the X-Men show. If I don't play it, you could probably play it in your mind. Right? You got Wolverine here, you got Magneto in the background, you got Storm and Cyclops and all these, I haven't even watched anything like this in years, but you remember this stuff. What were the X-Men? The X-Men were these mutants who had these powers that they were able to use for good. And if you see Magneto right there on the left, well, he was not good. He basically thought of the mutants as being a higher race than the humans. And I want to say this here because we'll have to talk about this in another podcast now, which is the relationship between evolution and racism. It is one that people like to downplay or say that that's not really there. I know people want to try to go to the Bible and say that maybe that there's racism there in Scripture and that it's espoused in Scripture or something like that. It's ridiculous. The Bible tells us that everybody came from the same two parents, Adam and Eve. So the idea of racism is completely ridiculous. The other thing is that race in general, there's only one race. There's a human race. And the Bible is clear on that. So the idea of there being different races is not a Bible thing or a believer thing. It's really more of an evolution thing. And here's what I mean. Even in the Marvel movies, right? What do you have? You have this sense that these mutated people, these mutants, are a different race from the regular people. And what are we to do? How are we to treat these mutants? And so sometimes you have the regular people wanting to fight against the mutants or wanting to exterminate them or whatever the case, and vice versa. So you have somebody like Magneto who says, we mutants need to stick together. The X-Men, well, he wasn't one of the X-Men, but the mutants need to stick together and fight against these regular people. We need to preserve our race. Now, again, biblically, there's one race, there's a human race. So the idea of racism in itself is assuming some idea that doesn't exist, that there's a black race and a white race and a whatever race. There aren't races. There are different ethnicities, of course. There are different groups of people that are divided by language and by various things. But there's one race, there's the human race. And so, but with evolution, you see, with evolution, it introduces this idea of races. It introduces this idea of there being a difference between these different groups of people. Because ultimately, if all humans ultimately came from apes, then some of us are closer to the apes than others of us. And as somebody that's black, I'll tell you right now, generally, it's the black people that are viewed and shown as being closer to the apes than the white people. So you can understand that, yes, I don't believe in evolution in general, but there's a personal reason to fight these kinds of ideas myself, because I understand that this has often been weaponized to say that those black people over there, they're closer to the apes. And you might say, well, there were believers that did that too. Maybe there were, but they were going against what the Bible says. Evolution naturally leads you to this idea about there being different races, there being different groups of people, and that there's this separation, right? And that if you're closer to the apes, why shouldn't you have fewer rights than the people that aren't as close to the apes? And there's vice versa. So there are black versions of this as well, where black people will say, well, the white people are close to the apes, right? So it's all wrong. It's all ridiculous. But understand that that's a feature, not a bug of evolution. That stuff that leads to racist ideas and ideologies. That's what it leads to. We should do a video on that eventually. So in Marvel, you see this, and people don't really talk about it, but you see it. You see this idea of the mutants are this different race, and that the mutants are the superhumans, right? That the mutated people are superhumans. And what do we do with those regular humans? And they are better humans. They have these powers. They can shoot lasers out of their eyes, and they can control the weather, and they can control metal like Magneto, or they can shoot like claws out of their wrists, or not wrists. Wolverine has these claws that come out of his hands, and just all these different mutant powers, right? And the idea fundamental to the X-Men is that they evolve these powers. Now, what do we see in real life? In real life, if a doctor comes to you and says, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, your child has a mutation, do you start jumping for joy? Do you start getting happy when your doctor tells you that your child has a mutation? No. Do you know why? Because mutations are almost always neutral or harmful, and they are very rarely helpful. So a person doesn't have a mutation and they say, I'm so sorry, but now he has superhuman strength. Right? Like the doctor doesn't come to you and say, oh, I'm so sorry, your child has this mutation, but he can shoot lasers out of his eyes. Oh, I'm so sorry, your child has this mutation, but now she can control the weather. I'm so sorry. Like in the case of Professor X in the X-Men, your child has this mutation and he can read people's minds. This is X-Men stuff, right? This science fiction, science fantasy, like that's what it is. And yet this is the core of the evolutionary mythology, is that essentially mutations over and over again have made things better in the world. That and again, let's talk about what a mutation is, by the way. That DNA is being copied, and the DNA is not copied accurately. So it's not copied exactly. Now, God has made it that way so that there can be variations. And in many cases, those variations can be harmful or neutral. In the rare case, you can have things that are not copied exactly, and there are some small changes in the genetics and the DNA. So when you look at something like what is called natural selection, I don't like the term because to say selection means that nature is selecting something. Nature doesn't select anything. Animals or people or organisms of whatever kind are more or less fitted for their environment. They are better suited for their environment. But nature isn't selecting anything. But this is the kind of thing that Darwin and evolutionists can often do, where they give agency to something that has no agency because it doesn't make sense otherwise. No, God put this adaptability into organisms so that they could survive. God did that. He made them that way. It's a design feature. So then to take something that God designed and then try to take him out of it is what is happening when people call it natural selection. So in real life, a person who is a mutant doesn't have some superpower, but instead we look at that and say, I'm so sorry, right? There's some kind of disorder. There's some kind of problem. There's some kind of health issue that arises from that. We all know this. Nobody gets happy and says, "Ooh, well, what superpower does he have?" When the doctor tells you that your child has a mutation. Nobody says that. That's just in Marvel, and that's just in the evolutionary mythology. It makes it sound like that humans are essentially a Marvel character origin story, right? Like evolutionary mythology is not biological. It's a Marvel character origin story. So let me give you 3 problems with evolution, and then we'll kind of bring this to a close for today. Problem number 1 with evolution. The fossil record does not line up with the mythology that they give you. What do they say? There was a single-celled organism that's the precursor to all of life. Abiogenesis says there was basically non-living matter, and then some life popped up, which is a huge gap. Abiogenesis is the god of that gap. But then evolution says, well, okay, now you have some life, and that life eventually brought us to what we see today, for example, with humans. Excuse me if you heard that burp. So if you look at the fossil record, it just doesn't show this progression from these single-celled organisms to the complex organisms that we see now, like humankind. Maybe you're familiar with an image like this. I'm kind of cutting off part of it here, but it kind of shows you got the monkey, you got the monkey on 2 legs, you got the monkey on 2 legs looking more human in the facial and now picking up stuff, and then you have 3 humans, one with a long beard and kind of short, one's a little taller, no beard, and then one guy that's at a desk at a computer, right? And this is supposed to be this progression of how things have gone evolutionarily. And I don't know, after that, they'll probably have somebody over here that's, I don't know, whatever the next thing is that we have. The thing I want to point out here is that whenever you have these kinds of progressions, there's always a couple of, again, this is a story, so you have to keep in mind that all of this is a story. It's a mythology. The thing you have to keep in mind is, yeah, we have apes that are on all 4s. Yes, there are people that walk and use tools and have for thousands of years. You want to know what we don't see in the fossil record? Apes on 2 legs. Please find it. It's not there. There's nothing in the fossil record that has this creature right here or this creature right here. A lot of times they'll just have one that kind of represents that 4-leg to 2-leg. And again, that is a huge gap, by the way, to go from this to this right here. Because look at this. This thing is kind of hunched over, arms out in front. And so what it's trying to do is try to show this idea that there's a progression from this 4-legged, this quadrupedal position to a bipedal position, but still kind of hunched over, with remnants of the previous ape. There's nothing like these two things in the fossil record. You need to understand this. That problem number one is this is not in the fossil record. And if all the humans, billions of humans on Earth, came about from this, then it ought to be in the fossil record. And it ought to be all over the place in the fossil record. It is nowhere to be found. It's a story. Yeah, we see apes. And yeah, we see humans. We don't see this ape human thing right here. It's not there. It's a gap, and they fill it in with, the evolutionary mythology. Problem number two. No one offers a plausible explanation for how these intermediate changes would have happened. Now, let me show you another picture, right? Similar kind of thing, right? And like I said before, you're always going to see these, some ape-like creature on two legs. It looks kind of like he's got like a goatee or something right here. So what they try to do is they say, oh, this is ape right here. And then he just started kind of getting up, bending forward like those other ones, and walking on two legs, but still has some things that are very similar. Maybe the way his arms are, maybe the way he has so much hair. So the hair was darker here. Now it starts getting lighter here. Then you got this guy right here. And again, these are all humans. So people try to act like, well, these are humans, and that's an ape. That ape human thing does not exist in the fossil record. But here's the question I ask for problem number two. Okay, you go from here to here. How? Well, actually, before we get to how, because how will be the next thing. Why? From a natural selection perspective, again, I hate the term, but let's just use it for now. From a natural perspective position, you have what you have right here is a terrible bipedal, or a terrible biped. He doesn't walk on two legs well at all. And now he probably does some four-legged walking here and there, but he's not good at that either. But the question you have to ask is, you see the optimized features here. This is a human, that's a human, and that's a human. And he could try to make them look shorter and have more hair and all of that, but these are all humans. So the question you have to ask, though, is this ape human thing right here, that's not a good human, and it's not a good ape in terms of its ability to transport itself, right? So I'm talking about locomotion here. So it's not quadrupedal locomotion, and it's not bipedal locomotion. What is this, and why is this? You see, according to evolution, the evolutionary mythology says that the changes, these mutations that occur, these changes, nature selects for the organisms that are best fitted for their environment. So the thing you have to point out, or the thing you have to figure out is, okay, what makes that thing who doesn't transport itself well on four or on two, what makes that thing better fitted for its environment? And they never give you an answer. They say, well, maybe it reached up. Maybe being on two legs allows it to reach up higher into the trees from time to time and do this. It's still a poor quadruped, and it's still a poor biped, and for a long time too. Keep in mind that these people are talking about time horizons of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So you have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years of being a really bad biped for a long time. And then finally you get the optimized body structures to now have your head be above here instead of you being hunched over, and where you now have the foot being different instead of being this ape-like foot. And see, even here they kind of have basically human. Again, it's all a story, so they make it up anyway. So you're completely making up this thing right here because it's not in the fossil record. So you're making it up, and you're essentially saying that there was this thing that basically had. I mean, it looks like he has like long johns on or something. I don't know, but this is not in the fossil record. And the thing that I'm saying here is that no one even attempts to give you a reason for any kind of selective pressures in nature that would have caused this really bad biped and really bad quadruped for a long time. Because as a bad quadruped, now it's not able to do the things that it was originally doing. And if it was a bad biped, it's not going to be able to have all of the advantages that the humans would eventually have. So what precisely would it be that would cause that? And there's no answer given. It's just a story that they tell you. Problem number 3 is the mechanism. And this is the thing we're getting at with the mutants part. The idea that the mechanism to cause these changes is mutations plus natural selection is ridiculous. Mutations don't produce anything. Except in the Marvel movies, right? Like in the Marvel movies, you can shoot lasers out of your eyes and you can control weather and you can read people's thoughts and you can grow claws out of your hands. Like you have these useful things that happen because you have this mutation. In real life, what mutations generally do is they break your genetic machinery. They mess things up. And so the accumulation of mutations over time, by the way, is something that there are a lot of geneticists that are very concerned that over time, there is this thing called genetic entropy. We mentioned entropy earlier, this idea of disorder. The rise of genetic entropy in humans is causing more and more disease over time. Now, that's not all of disease, and we'll talk about that at the very end, but there's a great deal of disease that's because of increased mutations. It's not that people are getting superpowers. That's not what's happening. That's a Marvel storyline. So, mutations and natural selection don't actually produce anything. They don't create new genetic information, which is what you would need to have these new structures that would happen over time. So let me give you an example of this. Look at a quadrupedal ape on the left here, and you got a human on the right. This is actually an image I made for my book, I Walk, Therefore I Am. One of the things you see is that the spinal attachment is at the back of the head for an ape, but the spinal attachment is at the bottom of the skull for a human. That's a completely different thing. And there are all kinds of other things. You look at the ribs, you look at where the pelvis is, you see that with the human, the spinal attachment, rib cage, and pelvis are all aligned vertically. Not so with the ape. This alignment vertically makes it easier. You have these arms that swing that allow for better balance from a bipedal perspective. You have these legs that are much different than the ape legs. And you have the feet and big toe that are completely different in the human than they are in the ape. Are we saying that the mechanism for this is mutations? That this mutated into this? Okay, yeah, in the Marvel movies maybe. But in real life, that's not what happens. And as we just mentioned earlier, everything that happens in between this and this, according to their story, they have no reason. They give no selective pressures to say this is why you would have had all of these different versions in between that get you from here to here. They don't even try to do it. Because again, it would be a lie, or let me not say lie. It would be a story anyway. And that's all this stuff is. It's stories. When you start digging into the details of it, it becomes that much more evident that these are stories that they tell, that they have no evidence for. And then when you push back on it, they tell you that you're not being scientific. All of this is science fiction. All of this evolution stuff. Okay. So let me summarize the 3 points again, the 3 problems. That when you look at this, we see quadrupedal apes, they exist. We see bipedal humans, either in the fossil record or they still exist. That's a human, that's a human, that's a human, that's an ape. This bipedal ape thing that they always have in these progressions, that thing is not found in the fossils, and it certainly doesn't exist, and we've never seen one. So as we mentioned, problem number 1, the fossil record hasn't closed this gap. We see apes, we see humans. They propose that there's some bipedal ape that happened, but there's nothing like that in the fossil record. Problem number 2, you need to show a series of selective pressures to go from a quadrupedal ape to a human. You need to show a reason in the environment that this would have happened. What would have made a bipedal ape that was bad at walking on 4 and bad at walking on 2? What would have made something like that rise? They don't even try to tell you. They just kind of say, well, maybe reaching up, maybe using tools, maybe. But all they're doing is they're looking at all these things that humans do well. And they're saying, well, that could have made that. But that's not the question. The question is, how would this intermediate version be better than this? It's bad at walking on 4 and it's bad at walking on 2. So why would that even be why would that not be something that it wouldn't be the fittest, so it wouldn't survive? They have no answer. They don't, and they would need to give a series, not one little pressure of reaching up, not one thing like having tools. You need a series to show the various changes that would need to happen. No one even attempts to do it. Finally, mutations didn't cause this. And I mentioned here co-evolved optimal features for bipedality. What I mean by that is that the physical structure and the neural structures both had to change. So the way I like to think about it is the hardware and the software of a human, right? We have the right hardware to walk on two legs, and we have the right software, meaning the neural networks and that part, our ability to control ourselves, which is different than what an ape has in it. So we have different hardware and software from monkeys and from apes. And the question is, are you trying to tell me that mutations caused the co-evolution of better hardware and better software for walking on two legs? That's what you're trying to tell me. And that's exactly what they're trying to tell you. But it doesn't make sense. Okay. So mutants and evolution in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, yeah, you need that. Because otherwise the X-Men stuff is just it's complete fantasy. They want it to be more science fiction. They want it to sound more sciencey. So that's why you need the evolution stuff, because it kind of sounds sciencey, but it's pseudoscience, right? Which is fine for Marvel. It's just not fine in real life. That's not what happens. So where do we go from here? We looked at magic, multiverses, and mutants, and we've concluded, hey, goes well with Marvel. It just doesn't happen in real life. And so to try to call that science is ridiculous. So what's the alternative? Well, what you could do is you could get your science from comic books, right? When we're talking about magic, multiverses, and mutants, this is what we see in the Bay model and this idea of Big Bang, abiogenesis, and evolution. You could get your ideas from that, which is really no different than getting it from a Marvel comic. Or you could get your science ideas from the designer of the universe and the one who made its laws. We see an ordered, fine-tuned universe, and that points to a thoughtful creator. We see the existence of life, which implies an eternal, ever-alive being. Let me tell you what I mean by this. Abiogenesis is magic. It's saying that there was non-living matter and it popped into becoming living matter. What we are saying is that there was an ever living being. There was an eternally living person who made life. So guess what? Life came from life. And Jesus himself calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. And he is the one who made all things. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. John chapter 1, verses 1-3. The one who made everything is the life. So the law of biogenesis holds. The diversity, complexity, and adaptability of life requires an intelligent designer. The diversity we see, the way that life is able to adapt, let's stop calling it natural selection. Let's call it something else. We see living things adapting and surviving. And that capability we see in life requires an intelligent designer. It's designed to be that way. It didn't just happen. It's not thoughtless. It's not random. God made it like that. So that's really the alternative. You can go with Bay, or you can go with the understanding that there is an intelligent designer and creator of the universe who is eternal and brought life into the world. Modern science began with people who understood this. Men like Newton, Faraday, Mendel, Pasteur, Galileo, and Maxwell. We could name off a lot of others. It's been really within the last 150, 200 years that people have gotten more and more away from that, to where if you acknowledge the things that we are saying, which are very simple, people get angry about it. Because again, it's a religious belief system, this evolutionary mythology, Bay. So now kids are being taught science fiction. I mean, essentially a Marvel plot, as if it's real science. And what I want to end with is that one of the implications, there are a bunch of implications to all of this. Obviously, people, lose faith, people walk away from Christianity, the truth. But one of the implications of this is that it actually hinders the progression of real science. And I just want to give a quick example of this. I have a friend who that I worship with, and it's interesting. He's in his 40s and has had he had like a triple or a quadruple bypass surgery. He's a guy that runs constantly, like he's in like ultra marathons and stuff like that. And I talked to him about like what the doctors will say to him, and the doctors essentially say, "Well, your genetics are bad, and that's because your genetics are bad. That's why you have these heart problems." Now, you know me, I'm a carnivore. I think his heart problems have to do with he eats too many carbs, and that his metabolism is broken. Now, again, that's not something I can just be like, "Hey, man, like what you should do is try more meat," because guess what? Guess what his doctors are going to say to him? No, red meat is bad. Now, here's the interesting thing: he's eaten the way that they want him to eat, and he's gotten worse. Now, you would think, hey, maybe I should try something else, right? Again, he's never going to try like, and again, maybe eventually he would, but I don't think he's going to ever try something like carnivore. But I think it would be one of the things that would help him turn things around. I mention this because there's so many diseases that are because of the common, the standard American diet, right? Where people are just eating way too much sugar and way too much of carbs that turn into sugar. And so you look at something like cancer, the emergence of heart disease, high blood pressure, Alzheimer's, dementia, diabetes, all of these things, many of well, really all of them. Go look it up, and how many of them can be connected directly to insulin resistance and a broken metabolism. And I've just seen so many instances of people turn things around, and it seemed like magic, to use a word that we've been saying today. Now, I say all that to say this: what my brother in the church, his doctors are telling him, well, it's your genetics that are bad, and cholesterol is bad. And he's like, well, they tell him to lower his cholesterol, and they put him on these drugs and stuff to lower his cholesterol. And his arteries keep getting worse. And if he wasn't as active as he was, he wouldn't even be in the place that he is now. But it's like, I look at this and I go, these people are still talking about genetics because they think about everything in terms of evolution. And what often believers don't understand is that these doctors are saying this stuff, and it's not based on evidence. It's just based on that they've been taught this same stuff all the time, and that everything is genetics. And so, yes, he might be more, like, for example, I'm more predisposed to have diabetes in my family. I was pre-diabetic a couple of years back. And again, that's one of the reasons why I went carnivore, and I reversed my pre-diabetes in a matter of months from just eating meat, and haven't been in those really poor ranges yet. Now, here's one of the things: my cholesterol is sky high. My LDL, which they say is bad cholesterol, which I don't even know what that means. Your body produces cholesterol. So what is bad cholesterol? But that's what these doctors are saying. Well, you have bad cholesterol. And even on my printouts, they say, well, it looks like you might have a genetic predisposition towards high LDL cholesterol. You have hypercholesterolemia. And I'm like, yeah, I'm good. I feel better. And what's so interesting is that this is what I'm saying with this evolution stuff, is that even it seeped into these kinds of things where these are harder sciences, and yet these people believe these things that are not true. And you don't even realize the implications of these people who in their biology, in their medical practice, when you do not understand that a God created this body to heal itself, and we see people's bodies breaking down, nobody's saying, what about the food? Nobody's saying, why don't we eat something that's closer to real food? Nobody's saying that. And if you try to say it, you look like you're crazy or something. And so I get it. So maybe you've gotten to the end of this video and you're an agnostic or you're an atheist, and you kind of say, well, yeah, that does look like a Marvel movie. Keep watching the pod. You're going to see that there's real evidence for the existence of God, and there always has been, but much of it is suppressed. And so what you have to do is decide that you want to follow after truth. And when you go in that direction, if you keep following and keep looking for truth, you'll eventually find that. So that's it for today's show. We wanted to talk about magic and multiverses and mutants, and how evolution really kind of opens the door for those kind of things that really just belong in a Marvel movie. That's it for today's show. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, please subscribe. Hit the notification bell if you're wanting to see these videos. They generally come out at 7 a.m. Central Time on Sundays. So be looking out for the next video. I'm going down the line now of really doing a lot more stuff, really going deep diving into the evidence against evolution. That seems to be more of what many of you are wanting to see, and so that's the direction we're going to. Still going to do some apologetic stuff where we're talking about the existence of God and things like that, but I'm going to be doing a lot more where we're kind of hitting this idea against evolution, because that seems to be something that is really being helpful to people. So thanks for watching. If you haven't already, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, keep asking questions, keep the faith.